Hello and welcome to the CVL podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition in the brain, and with each episode we'll be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is the CVL podcast. In this episode, we meet with Dr. Vishnu Murty, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon, where he also leads the Adaptive Memory Lab. He completed his undergraduate degree in neuroscience at Brown University and then pursued a fellowship at the National Institute of Mental Health before earning his PhD in neurobiology from Duke University. His research primarily focuses on cognitive neuroscience, learning, memory, motivation, and adaptive behavior, and he investigates how the physiological properties of the nervous system influence memory and decision making, particularly in different motivational and affective or emotional states. To approach these questions, he uses a combination of novel behavioral paradigms, functional neuroimaging, computational modeling, and natural language processing. He investigates these processes across a variety of affective and motivational states, including reward, novelty, agency, and threat. He also probes these systems in individuals who have psychopathology or may be at risk for psychopathology to better understand the role of memory in adaptive behavior. And he specifically looks at this in the domains of psychosis and post-traumatic stress disorder. In this episode, we discuss the relationship between emotions and memory, and we learn how memory can reflect our goals and desires, and how we can use our goal states to drive adaptive memory, which is memory that is adaptive for survival and decision making. We also learn about the effects of the neurotransmitter dopamine on memory and how it can enhance memory, particularly memory for rewards or for things that hold more value to us. Emotions and decision making can also enhance memory, and Dr. Murty shares his findings relating to this. So join us as we sit down with Dr. Murty to understand the impact of emotion, motivation, and goals on memory and cognitive function.
Dr. Murty, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin discussing your work, could you explain what drew you to the field of neuroscience and in particular memory research?
Yeah, it was a bit of a long journey. I was what you call a hot mess in college. So I swapped through like 8 different majors in the course of 3 years. And I started like very much on the engineering side. And then it felt like too cold in some ways. And then I saw myself just like slowly creeping my way closer and closer to something that has like, I don't know, what felt like more dimensions, which got me into psychology. But in that path, I like swapped through biology all the way through, and I loved all of it, right? But I wanted more of that like human feel, and memory is this like wonderful space that we can actually study it at so many different levels of analysis, all the way from like, you know, cells in the hippocampus to the actual human experience of a feeling of it. So it really like sort of like hit all the spots at one time to be able to like study human behavior, but also be grounded in neuroscience.
Yeah.
So your research explores how memory is influenced by factors like motivation, emotion, and reward. So let's discuss these factors one by one. So firstly, how does motivation impact memory?
Yeah, so it's interesting, the idea to think about them studying it one by one. And maybe this is just because I'm like a really grandiose thinker, but I think it's sort of the same thing for all of them, right? So like, we as humans have made up all these different words, right? Trying to delineate motivation, affect, emotion. But I think what it really is just about goal states across the board, right? Like we remember things that are important, right? But important is like a really idiosyncratic idea, right? So depending on whatever our environmental cues are in any given moment, that is going to be what determines what's important, and that in turn is going to sort of shape the way we see the world and actively like move our way through the world, which then is sort of going to like cause this natural flow of progression down down to memory, right? So if we think about motivation more classically, I always give the example of like, imagine you're going on a hike, right? And you could go on a hike and you could be like, oh, my friend told me it's got the most like beautiful summit in the world, right? You get like a gorgeous vista, right? And then you can think back on what you think about in that hike, and it's like full of joy and excitement, right? And anticipation, and you're like seeing all the things around it. But like, I'm personally like a huge snake phobic, right? And I even like remember this, that like if I saw a snake anywhere near the beginning of the hike, all I was encoding the rest of the time was tree branches that sort of looked like snakes, right? So even though my perceptual input is near identical across these experiences, it's sort of like you only see the world through the filter of the goals that you're keeping in mind, right? So in that way, that's going to have all the downstream consequences. So it's like a big idea, but then it can account for all these different sort of phenomenology that we see in like affective memory as like a giant.
So it's kind of like your attention becomes selective. Is that related to that?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's like, what is attention, right? So when I've tried to use the word of attention during selective, it like works mostly, but then it's just sort of throwing more cognitive semantics into the space that doesn't sort of get me closer to trying to understand what's happening. So this is why I really like to adopt the word goal state, right? Because it has some utility later, and then that helps me sort of understand more. So what in the current land space is providing utility in a given moment? And yeah, you can use attention to think about that, but it sort of has one more layer of purpose that sort of gets embedded in the framework of how we're thinking about memory.
Yeah, I like that, and that kind of understanding of using the goal state as the kind of terminology, because if you think about motivation and emotion and reward, like with the hike analogy you just gave, your motivation was reaching the top and your emotion was joy and the reward was seeing the view, and then you see the snake and it switches to avoiding snake and fear, and your reward is not seeing a snake, I guess. Like that whole goal just changes everything.
So we've tried to I sort of write off semantics as semantics, but they're so important, right? So in the end of grad school, we were trying to write a review paper. My graduate advisor at the time was Allison Adcock. And we were sitting down, and you could see in every paper of my grad work, we changed the words, right? So the first paper said reward and punishment. The second paper said approach and avoidance motivation, right? So then it said gain and loss, right? Like we couldn't land on words. And we literally had to sit for 3 hours brainstorming, how do we want to think about these constructs, right? And we landed with these words that we just sort of made up to use. They're real words that existed. But we landed on calling it interrogative and imperative motivation to sort of capture all these things. So interrogative being are you curious about the world? Do you have room to entertain multiple goals at the same time? And then do you actually have the time to explore those goals in a way that you have control? Versus an imperative state where you sort of are occupied with one really single urgent goal, right? That needs to get resolved really quickly. And the reason we like this is because we kept on coming up with all these exceptions to the rule for everything else. So you can be oh, let's use reward, right? It's a positive thing that you seek, but then you get a drug addict that is intensely seeking a reward. And that is so much closer to a state of threat than it is to reward seeking. That's oh, that doesn't work, right? Or you think about sort of the fear of, I'll use my own example. I'm terrified of snakes, right? Seeing a snake in the woods is so different than me anticipating going to see a snake at the zoo beforehand, right? So it's these words like valence didn't work and reward and punishment didn't work. So that's why we sort of made up our own framework.
So what exactly is that relationship between emotion and memory?
Tell me more what the question is.
Is there a difference between because we have various emotions, we have positive emotions, we have negative emotions. How do they influence memory? How do they influence how much you remember something? Yeah,
so I think this is again where we ended up stepping away. This I can't answer this question, right? This is the reason why we had to step away with it, because if you think about positive memories, right? This is 30 plus years in emotional memory research has been trying to look at the effects of valence on memory. But then you go to the most classic stim set people use, like the memoranda that people are looking at, which is this International Affective Picture System set. And you look at the positive things, and in the same genre of positive stimuli is a sunset, a toddler eating ice cream, and erotic photos, right? And you could use positive to describe all three of these things, but there is no way that those are motivating us in the same way, right? And that's going to have the downstream consequences on memory. But you need words to define space, right? Or else you're in like a completely like jimble. So we started thinking, this is work I did with Dave Cluett. We wrote an empirical framework where we're saying, okay, let's not use the word, let's not use valence anymore. And we're like, can we split this on dimensions of arousal and behavioral activation, right? So arousal is still like in emotion research, how intense is this happening? But then we thought behavioral activation is a really nice way to think about it. Is it causing you to freeze or is it causing you to explore, right? And we think those are sort of more important factors that are going to dictate the fate of a memory rather than thinking about valence itself, because you can think of positive or negative things that encourage you to explore, or positive and negative things that cause you to
So you're kind of defining it based on the outcome, that behavioral outcome.
Behavioral outcome, and then also the behavioral antecedent a little bit might be more, meaning like it's almost close to embodied cognition, like these ideas that, you know, the way you're using your body is going to change the way you think. I think the way you're actively searching the world is going to be the most important determinant for what your memory looks like. Right? Like, are you curious or are you terrified? Right? Like, that's more important than actually what the nature of the stimulus is itself. So to do this, right, it's like it's a hard task. So we actually stopped using, well, not completely. We've limited our use of stimuli that are intrinsically positive or intrinsically negative. And rather now we're just trying to manipulate people's motivational state while they're looking at neutral stimuli, right? So this gives us a clear sense of that it's like, this has nothing to do with the thing that you're trying to remember. It's just sort of the like sunglasses you're wearing while you're staring at this thing, or like emotional sunglasses.
So is there any relationship between reward versus threat and memory?
Yeah, so I think what we do find is when you're in these more like curious states that are often associated with reward, our data is showing that you build these sort of beautiful, rich relational maps of the world, right? It's not just, okay, here is the event, but it's like, oh, here's the event and here's how it's connected to 10 different events that happened in the past. And let's also grab all the things that were like curious along the way, because maybe they'll become important later, right? And you sort of get this like giant web of information that happens. It almost reminds me of A Beautiful Mind, where you see all the strings attached to like 30 different things. You're getting these much more complicated, but at the same time abstract knowledge stores in those states. But then we are seeing when you get closer to something that's going to cause you to freeze or be threatened or sort of like, you know, inhibit your action, you get these wonderful, precise details of the things that pop out the most, right? But then you sort of lose all of the information around it, right? You're ending up with like a very narrow trace of one thing, but it's that narrow trace that's like really under the microscope. And you can imagine these are like two ends of a spectrum.
Yeah, I've heard about situations where individuals, let's say they've been held at gunpoint and they can't recall, like, you know, the individual who was holding the gun, but they have detailed memory of what the gun looked like,
right? Because
all of the focus was on the gun, but they can't recall who was holding that gun.
Yeah, it's these classic weapon focus effects, and they usually look at that as a sense of like threat, but my argument would be if you even have like a really intense, joyful thing, like your baby laughing or your puppy licking your face, it's like the same thing as long as the intensity side. Actually, if there's room for a random anecdote, I was living in New York when I was a postdoc, and I was walking down the street with a friend, and I saw a really cute dog, and I was like staring and giving a bunch of attention to the dog. And my friend was like, Deepa, stop being so rude. And I was like, what do you mean stop being so rude? And I looked up and Alec Baldwin, it was him walking his dog. I had no sense that Alec Baldwin was there because like my high intensity emotion was like focused on this puppy and nothing else. So that's like the positive flip of the weapon focus effect is Alec Baldwin walking his dog.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, you are known for your pioneering work in adaptive memory, which suggests that these processes can be adaptive for survival and decision making. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, I sort of have to start with saying I'm like a bit of a fraud. So, no, as much as I study adaptive memory, 90% or 95% of my research program has been on the memory end of it, right? And to really call it adaptive, we need to start looking at decision making more. And we've just started to scratch the surface of looking at memory decision making interactions, but we're doing a lot of the foundational work first just to try to understand in general before moving into motivation space at all, like how are we using memories to guide decision making. So that's one way we've been trying to show adaptiveness. The place where I think we've done a lot more work is actually by pivoting to what happens when your memories are maladaptive. So we've been studying people who are at risk for different clinical disorders, and this is another way that we've been really able to try to figure out what the role of memory as an adaptive behavior is, what happens when it goes wrong, right? And we've mostly been studying this in the domains of risk for psychosis, risk for PTSD, and risk for social anxiety, because I think fundamentally all three of these things are very tightly wound up with being memory disorders, where that might be obvious in PTSD, but I think they're actually like just as critical for things like social anxiety and psychosis.
Right. Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, when I think about your anecdote about Alec Baldwin, I mean, the fact that you focused in on the dog and didn't see anything else, you could see how somebody with psychosis or some kind of disorder could focus in, or social anxiety might focus in on this one detail, which I guess relates to their anxiety or relates to whatever they're feeling, and ignore everything else that's going on, which would maybe objectively help them not go through that emotion. So
what's interesting, and this is all in the like theoretical stage, we're just starting up a lot of these studies right now to apply these memory frameworks to it. And I'm not the only one that's thinking this in the world right now, right? There's a lot of people that are doing this. But I think in some ways, psychosis and social anxiety are actually direct opposite trajectories of what's happening with memory systems. So some of the data we're finding in social anxiety is that we do see this, right? People with social anxiety will overemphasize negative feedback in memory as they go through. We have a recent paper that shows that most people in the world will have a positivity bias. So say you don't actually remember the feedback you got in a social interaction, you'll tend to lean more to the positive end. But the more social anxiety you have, particularly during adolescence, which let's add in more factors to complicate the space of an already complicated space, they tend to show really high negativity biases for ambiguous feedback. So that really seems like not only am I centering in on negative social situations, I will even take my prior knowledge and schemas that were all built by prior episodes, right? It's like a unfortunately terrible positive feedback loop, and take all ambiguous situations and then cast them in the light of something negative, right? On the other hand, when we've been looking at psychosis, what we're finding is sort of an overgeneralization of memory, right? So rather than narrowing memory to one thing that's important, you see a lot more of like hyper salience detection, and these aren't individuals with psychosis. This is even as early as people that are at risk for developing psychosis. They will basically mark more things as salient than not, right? And then when you start marking a lot of things as salient, you can start to bind those things together again to an overcomplicated framework, and then that might be something that is sort of the ground bed for something like a delusion is, or paranoia is by having sort of an over-exaggerated salient system, whereas in social anxiety, it might be a really narrow salient system.
Right. So when people think of memory disorders, most often they think of things like dementia, which involves a loss of memory. But as you were just mentioning, memory disorders can also be caused by intrusive or excessive remembering, like PTSD or psychosis. So how does your work on the neural mechanisms that underlie memory apply to people that suffer from these conditions?
Yeah, so let me start with all of my qualifying statements before I start to speculate. I am not a clinician in any ways, nor have I ever been trained as a clinician, right? So some caution is necessary when you get a basic scientist talking about what they think is happening in the brain to lead to clinical disorders. The other sort of forewarning, too, is that when we do research, we're always talking about large populations of people. We're not at a space that we can really do the types of work we all do at the level of individual subjects. So by definition, when you talk to a basic scientist about clinical disorders, they're going to be overgeneralized and sort of casting, way too far of a net. So I just always, before I start talking about clinical populations, like to put that out there that I'm not talking about any individual person in the world and somebody who has their own history with mental health stuff. I can get angry when I read papers that are and this is what depression's like. And I'm like, well, not for me, right? So all the qualifiers first before I sort of jump into this wild speculation domain. Okay, now did I lose where I am by putting all of my caveats in first? Okay, so important caveats. So I think what we've learned, and this is that we don't know enough yet at all, which is always the story with research. But if we focus on PTSD, one thing I've been really excited about, and we've been doing this mostly in sort of normative models, so individuals without PTSD but looking at their fear memory. But it maps on well to PTSD symptoms, is that we say memory disorders, right? But then we have to really think what is a memory? And the reason I say this is that if you look at symptoms of PTSD, they show two sets of symptoms that in many ways seem in direct contrast to each other, right? So one that we hear about a lot and you sort of see in popular media a lot is this idea of flashbacks, right? So people will have these very highly sensory specific moments of the traumatic event that sort of intrusively get into memory. It's hard to know what it's cued by or whether it's cued by anything or if it's spontaneous, right? And in those moments, they feel like they are reliving the event as it occurred, right? So this is hyper-specific memory. But on the same hand, they will sometimes take an element of that and have a really broad, generalized memory of it, right? So imagine you're on a walk and you get bit by a specific dog. At the same moment that somebody might be reliving the experience of, the pain they felt in the moment that they're being bit by the dog, they are also triggered by all dogs, right? Which is the opposite of specific. That's very general and gist-based. So one thing we've been trying to figure out is how can you simultaneously take the same event and have these two, what seem at face value, opposite memory phenomenology coming from it. But the question now is that we don't even know, is this the same representation that's driving both of these behaviors? Or is the brain actually holding two representations in parallel, one that's sensory specific and one that's over generalized? And our preliminary data in a set of individuals without PTSD, but we have them watching horror movies, and we're just seeing how are you storing your memory for these really high arousal events that we can have happen in the scanners, that it seems like they're holding two separate representations in the hippocampus, which we know is really important for memory, but in more anterior regions of the hippocampus, the parts of the hippocampus that are closer to your front of your head or your eyes, right? We're getting much more sort of less detailed memories that seem more just which we think are probably really primed for generalizing to all events that might be related to the source of fear. But then in the back of the brain, in the posterior hippocampus, we're showing connectivity between the posterior hippocampus and perceptual cortex is actually storing all the details of the memory, right? So now you have these two things sort of running in parallel, and then it's, okay, well, what's happening in the environment or inside of your head that's causing you to trigger one versus the other, which in some ways is oh no, I have the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, because one well-known function at the hippocampus is pattern separation, right? So it helps us separate events that are occurring, so we're able to discriminate between certain events that are not the same thing, right? So how does that work with PTSD? Is this pattern separation impaired? When you talk about
so there's some really strong data, especially from rodent models, that threat can really cause you to have a disruption of pattern separation processes, particularly if you're like under continuous threat, right? So a lot of the animal models have looked at like early life stress where they're giving a really rough life to these young mice and rats, right? But then you think about something like PTSD, and what we're learning more and more is that symptoms of PTSD are exacerbated if you face early life stress or if you're under continuous stress. There's a lot more people now in the past 5 years talking about complex PTSD, which is no longer about a single event that occurred, right? Like when we think of PTSD, it's like, oh, you were held up a gunshot or, you know, you were in a car accident, this one single event. But you imagine people that had tough parents, right, or social isolation all the way through childhood. You can't really pinpoint one event, but they're often having phenomenology and sort of alterations in brain structure that look the same as these people that undergo sort of one immediate threat, right? So what we have been seeing is that in both of these cases, sort of exposure to like a very high threatening situation or a continuous low level that are both sharing common a disruption of pattern separation signals in the hippocampus, which could then cause all this generalization, right? But then at the same hand, we have to ask, well, then what's causing this really, really separated flashback that's happening?
So I just want to go back to the fact that you said you have people watching horror movies in the scanner. Because we all, well, you know, as researchers, we know how important it is for people to stay still. And I'm just wondering how you achieve that.
Yeah, so we do a lot of training, to keep your head still. And the one thing we've been avoiding is we're not showing horror movies with jump scares, right?
I was going to say, that's what I was imagining.
We're doing a lot more like suspense and gore rather than jump scares because, it's by definition the response.
So speaking of scanning, like what kind of methods do you use in general to study memory and these relationships?
So when we are interested in behavior, just recently in the past 3 years, we've been getting into more naturalistic techniques because we wanted to get more about the like phenomenology of what a memory feels like, right? And this was actually inspired very much of wanting to try to understand PTSD more, right? When you talk to somebody with a memory disorder in a clinical sample, it's not like they give you a list of words that describe their experience, right? They're embedded in this narrative of what's happening. But classically, the way we studied emotional memory was, okay, here's a picture of a spider, and now here's a picture of a neutral book, and now here's a picture of a dog barking, and here's a picture of, and it's really almost impossible to conceptualize what a memory narrative is when you're just giving people these individual elements one at a time. So I had a graduate student, David Gregory, that was really interested in sort of expanding the way we look at emotional memory by using more naturalistic stimuli. So the first set of studies we did in this sort of new domain was we actually used a staged event approach where you can find something where you know what's happening in the event every night and bring your participants to that event. So there's this awesome haunted house in Philadelphia that was willing to pair with us to do these studies. And
really
they ran
studies.
the same. Yeah, and it was great because people were terrified, right? And then we could actually probe their memory for these events. But we can't really have portable MRIs that people walk around with. And we use MRI a lot to answer your question to try to understand what's happening in the brain during these encoding moments. So then we're like, what do we do, right? Like, what do we do? And that's how we landed on horror movies, is because we wanted to be able to see what was happening when people were encoding these. But then we're like, wait a minute, though, this isn't the same, because when you're like walking through the world, you're walking through the world, right? Like, how am I supposed to look at freezing behavior when you're passively watching a movie? So now the next iteration of studies, we're trying to find a balance between both, is that we are now studying people playing horror video games. So you still have at least a little bit of the action and like virtual mobility in the space, but that's something that you could do in the scanner. We haven't done it yet because we're still trying to work out the kinks of studying video game behavior. But we're really trying to like broaden how we're looking at emotional memories.
So I kind of want to come back to emotions and memory. How does the emotional weight of a decision influence its impact on memory? So, for example, do high-stake decisions create stronger memories than routine ones?
Yeah, so this is something we've just started to study, right? So like I said earlier, we've been really interested in how you sort of move through the world being the determinant of your memory. But it's been really hard, right, to study that in a laboratory. So then we switched to, what's a way you sort of move through the world in a cognitive sense is you can make decisions about different things. So in 2016, we started to do some really simple studies of, am I going to allow you to pick which card to flip over versus me making you pick one card to flip over and looking at people's memory for those, right? So arguably a low stakes decision. But even for this really arbitrary low stakes decision, we were showing that people had better memory by engaging systems that we classically think of involving in reward. So these mesolimbic dopamine systems, but this is sort of outside of the construct of reward. Just by making a button press to flip over a card, people were having better memory for these stimuli, right? And these were the lowest stakes decisions in the world. They had no impact on the outcome of what you're going to see next. And then slowly we've been trying to turn up that knob to try to understand what happens when you shift how important the decision is. So in this line of research, we've been really much more focused away from the threat side and more closer towards the exploration of the world side. And what we found, I think the best example of this is there's this sweet spot of when you know a little bit about the world, but not everything, that your decisions end up being the most consequential. And it's in those moments that you get the biggest boost of learning and the most engagement of these mesolimbic dopamine systems and the hippocampus, right? So it seems like when your decisions have the most impact for closing knowledge gap might be the word, that's when this comes up. So I'm talking like no specifics at all, right? But we can imagine, imagine you're in an escape room, right? Have you guys done
yes,
escape rooms before? Okay, yes. So you start an escape room and you have no idea what you're doing, right? So you might just be randomly opening doors or searching around the space. And if you think about it, there's like your memory of those moments, they're pretty low, right? Because you're not really goal oriented. You don't really know. You don't have an inkling of a situation that might be driving.
You're just like exploring the environment for
right?
now.
But then you're like, oh, I see that there's, playing cards in these 4 spots. And then all of a sudden you're like, I have some knowledge, but I don't know how the puzzle pieces fit together, right? And then you start making decisions, and the weight of those decisions become really, really important. So it's like you have medium amounts of uncertainty about the world, and your decisions have the most impact to resolve that uncertainty. And that's where we're finding sort of the greatest consequence on memory. And what's neat is that it's not just memory for the stuff that you uncover, but we're finding sort of this natural enhancement of the temporal sequence of memories. So people start to remember, what happened first, what bridged them to the next event, and then what happened next. So it's really about the flow of sequences that you get when you're making these weighty decisions. And if you go back to this idea of it's all about goals and it's all about framing, if you're on a treasure hunt, who cares what you see along the way unless you know how you got there and how to make it happen again, right? So then action sequences become much more important than memory for individual items.
I mean, that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective as well. If you think about people having to explore their environment to search for food or whatever it might be, or to avoid threats, that kind of would make the most logical sense of how you'd expect it to work, right? Yeah,
which either makes these the most exciting studies in the world or the dumbest, right? Like I was talking to my nephew's getting really interested in science. And I think I told him about, we had like a video game study where we were looking at order memory. And his official statement was like, duh. And I was like, cool. Yeah. That was 2 years of work, buddy.
Yeah, but now we can image, right, what's happening in the brain. Whereas, I mean, it's common sense, but before this, we didn't know what's happening in the brain, what regions are mediating these behaviors. So we are, you are advancing.
It was more kind of like we were hypothesizing. Like it
was just hypothesizing.
But to actually see that it really is and confirm that.
Okay, can I share your email with my nephew?
Yes,
you tell him how cool I am. Yeah. I'll play this for him.
So your research looks at how neuromodulatory systems influence memory and memory-guided decision-making. Could you explain to our listeners what a neuromodulatory system is and how does this relate to memory?
Of course, yeah. So this is actually going back to the idea of one of the reasons I was drawn to memory so much is that we have models of it that live at the cell, models that live at it at the level of animals, and then models of it in humans, right? And studying neuromodulatory systems has been sort of the most rewarding in terms of being able to connect the animal literature with human literature, right? So a neuromodulatory system, you can think about the brain has a certain mode of operating, right? So, we'll fire at this level A when we're responding to this, right? But sometimes we get in shifts in states, right? And when we're in the states might be really elevated or really down too. And this isn't happening just in one region at a time, but it's sort of more systemically across the brain, right? And we use the word neuromodulatory to sort of think about the mechanisms that drive these statewide shifts in the tone or the, what's the word for it? Like the gain of the system of your brain and how it's operating, right? A lot of times this is through neurochemicals rather than just sort of differences in firing. So this could be something like having increases or decreases in stress hormones like cortisol, increases and decreases in things like dopamine or norepinephrine, all these words that we hear of different neurotransmitter systems. They're not just targeting one region at a time, but they're sort of changing the way the brain works in concert. And I think with that whole change in brain networks, you're getting a change in information processing, which we then think that change in information processing is going to change what you're sort of encountering and how you form memories.
So we've seen a lot of oversimplified claims about dopamine in popular media. There's often confusion about dopamine just being like a pleasure chemical, but your work shows otherwise. So can you tell us, help us better understand the role of this neurotransmitter in motivation and memory?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I want to pull my hair out like 3 times a week hearing people talk about dopamine as it's this like magical reward.
It's just become part of the vernacular, right? People are like, I need to get my dopamine here.
Yes, or I have to detox from dopamine. Yeah. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. So I think the way people use it, they're actually talking about endogenous opioid systems, not dopamine at all, because that has much more to do with pleasure than dopamine. What I think, and any simple explanation you try to give of these complex systems, I'm sure I'm making like 3 people out there really mad with my description of it. But my favorite description of it is that it is the thing that translate your goals into actions, right? So it doesn't matter about the outcomes, whether it's rewarding or punishing or novel. It's about that sort of vigor and drive state to make something happen in the world. So one of my favorite examples of this came from this wonderful researcher, Jaak Panksepp. And what he did is they had this thing where a rat, there's food on the other side of the maze. They had to just sort of go over this sort of really effortful boundary to get to the food, and then they could take the food and eat it, right? So rats would sort of traverse this boundary and eat the food all the time. Then he knocked dopamine out of the system. And what he found is that the rats would no longer do the work to get over to the boundary to get the food. But if the researchers placed the food in the rat's mouth, they showed all the signs of enjoying it. They ate it. They consumed it just fine, but they wouldn't do the work to get it, right? And this is why we should like step back from thinking of it that it's this pleasure drug or this reward drug. It's much more a drug about invigorating action, right? So unless they mean that it's great to like run away from something you're scared of at night, because dopamine does that too, right? Like it has to encompass that description also.
Right.
So it's much more involved in motivation, basically.
I would say that a much more accurate way is to think about it in motivation, which also helps us understand why it's so important in motor movement, right? You look at something like Parkinson's disease, which is very centered on dopamine, and it doesn't mean that individuals with Parkinson's disease have problems experiencing joy in the world. They perfectly experience joy, right? It's a problem with initiating and executing motor actions.
That's a very kind of explicit example of drive needed to achieve something, right? Is being able to physically move to do something.
Yeah. So we've kind of touched on PTSD earlier, where individuals can have this overgeneralization memory of an incident that occurred, for example. But there's also been fascinating research on false memories. So how do motivational states influence not just what we remember, but how accurately we remember it?
Yeah, this is a great question. The first thing I think of is how we use the word false memories like they're bad, right? Like all of a sudden having a false memory is like, this is bad. But if you think about the world, a false memory can be really good sometimes, right? Like we often don't need the very specific thing that happened to us to explore what we do in the future. Sometimes it's like pretty good to have it be a little bit fuzzy, right? So it's about a balance of like, a little bit of false memory is good, but too much false memory is bad, and not enough might be hyper-specific. So what we've been finding a little bit is in the sort of curiosity state and sort of motivational states in that direction, we've been finding that it actually causes people to have a little bit of a fuzzy memory, right? There's more room for false memories, if that's what you want to call it. I would call it like adaptive generalization, right? But they mean the same thing. But we just have data coming out now. These have been mainly behavioral studies showing that reward motivation. So if we incentivize you to learn information with monetary rewards, it's actually inducing false memories for related information, right? And we see similar-ish phenotypes under threat, but in threat we see a much broader generalization, or in some cases a much narrower generalization, right? So we're still working our way through the world of, rather than true and false memory, I like to think a lot about like, how granular is the memory? Is it really fine detailed, or is it something closer to just like a category, right? And we've been finding that these more curious states put you somewhere in the middle, but states of extreme threat put you in one side or the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it can be very fuzzy, generalized,
or
extremely
very specific.
Yeah.
Interesting. Like you can think of when I get in a fight with like my mom, I will remember that one sentence that makes me feel the worst perfectly. Right. I can like repeat it back over and over. You said 10 years ago. Right.
Yeah,
like that's like
very, very specific memory for that one sentence.
Right. But in its own ways pretty false in terms of summarizing the conversation, because I've extracted one thing. This is why I'm like a little wavy on using the idea of false memory necessarily.
But there's also the concept of actual false memories. I remember hearing about a study that was done a while ago. I can't remember who did it, but it was something about convincing people that they had a memory of when they were a child of being left in an elevator or something and they couldn't find their parent, and none of them had experienced it. But they were able to convince
I have questions on the ethics of that study.
Right. No, make ethics worse. They did a set of studies similar to this where they photoshopped pictures of these kids like in childhood, like into situations they've never been in, so they could get visual evidence for this. So I haven't looked at that area of research too much, but my guess is that the only way one is going to be able to induce a false memory like that is that if it's congruent with their schemas of how the world works, right? If you get too far away from what is sort of a knowledge base that you believe, my bet is that people wouldn't be susceptible to those. So as much as they're false, they're either innocuous details that they're putting in there, or they're probably infusing it with details that are very congruent with what has actually happened in life, right? Which then, in some ways, I'm not denying that false memories exist. Like they definitely exist, but I think they always occur in a way that is representative of some truth, right? There has to be like some element of congruence with your own life narrative, or else you wouldn't generate those types of false memories. So there's like a tinge of truth even in the
if it's too bizarre for your life, you're like, that never happened. Like, that's impossible. So what role does stress play in memory, and how can we manage it effectively?
So what role does stress not play in memory might be the right. I might also just be, living in the world these days is full of it, right?
A lot of stress.
It plays so many roles. There's never been a literature that is like more complicated but still so important, right? And you see spaces where it enhances neutral memory, and then other studies that show that it doesn't enhance neutral memory, or spaces that shows that it's only emotional memory that gets enhanced, and other studies that don't show that, right? In the human literature, at least, I think the one steadfast and reliable finding that's been replicated a bunch of times is that when you're trying to retrieve a memory, it's harder under stress. The picture of what stress is doing while you're learning, I think, is still a little bit of a mixed bag. And some of that is complicated by the fact that probably like medium amounts of stress are really good. Too much stress is bad, but bad for what? Because other learning systems, a lot of stress is really good, right? So that picture is still unfolding in a really complicated way. But there is a good sense that, and retrieval, it's uniformly makes it worse, right? What to do about it is a great question that has nothing to do with my research training at all, but more of me being like indoctrinated in mindfulness. So I think it was when I first started becoming a professor. I think I was in my second year of my job, and I was under unbelievable amounts of stress. I don't even think I knew how much stress I was under, except if you looked at my hairline, like, you could probably tell from that way. And a senior colleague came to me and like very subtly just like forwarded me a workshop on mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is like an 8-week workshop. I was like, okay, I get the I get the
you get the message.
You're seeing me deteriorating. And I hyperbolic a lot and like easily excitable, but I can genuinely say nothing has changed my life more in terms of stress management than engaging with mindfulness. Just to realize when you're experiencing stress was huge, so you can do something about it, because I think so much of it lives underneath the layer of our conscious thought. But then 2, just like learning to pause and acknowledge what's happening in the moment. It's so simple, but so unbelievably hard to do, which is why I think like a workshop really helped me focus in and train on it. But I can really feel the difference.
Right. That's great. Yeah, I always tell myself I'm going to start doing mindfulness, but it never happens.
I mean, I bet people incidentally find their way into mindfulness without knowing it, right? Like that moment where you're so stressed out that you're like, I need to take a walk. That is the same thing as sort of sitting down for formal mindfulness practice, right? I think it's just sort of acknowledging it. And the best description I had of it, because I'm, like a little bit of like a Northeastern skeptic, right? Like when people were first telling me about mindfulness, I would just like roll my eyes and be like, okay, and then like, I'm not into this hippy dippy stuff. And then I went to the program, I was like, I guess I am into it. Like it's really helping. But it's just, if you think about it, it's just like a muscle you're training. Like nobody is going to sit down and be able to like nail mindfulness practice or meditation for half an hour, right? Like it's really like start with just noticing your breath once a day, and then sort of incrementally popping up on it. I really also, and this is just now unsolicited advice without any research, is start it when you don't need it, right? Like the worst time you can try to pick up mindfulness practices when you're
actually stressed. Yeah. That's great.
So where can our listeners learn more about your work?
They can go to my website, which is currently under construction because I just switched institutions. So as of 2025, you can find my website on the University of Oregon's Department of Psychology.
Great. Dr. Murty, thank you so much for joining us today and for the incredible contributions to the study of memory that you do, motivation, and adaptive behavior. We look forward to hearing about your future research.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Soumya Sambamurthy and Josh Olivier for editing this episode. To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.